So let me go ahead and introduce Michael Strong. Michael Strong is a pioneer in education and independent learning. He's the founder of innovative Socratic, Montessori, and Paideia schools and programs in Alaska, Florida, California, Texas, and New Mexico. Michael is the co-founder and serves as Chief Executive Officer and Chief Visionary Officer of Flow, which you can find on the internet. And he's the author of 2 texts. One, which we're not selling, is Be the Solution, How Entrepreneurs and Conscious Capitalists Can Solve the World's Problems. And the other one, which we are selling, the second is The Habit of Thought, From Socratic Seminars to Socratic Practices, which I have to say is a very good text. I've enjoyed it quite well. So we've had the pleasure of several professional development sessions with Michael Strong. Earlier on in the summer, Franklin Academy and Thales brought Michael in to do some sessions with us, and we've done some sessions yesterday. So we've had that professional pleasure past 2 times already. And I've had the distinct pleasure of having many interesting conversations with Michael about the future of education, which I've enjoyed a great deal. So without any further information, let's give him a hand.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Tim. I'm delighted to be here at the Luddy School Conference. I am extremely excited about the project that you are doing. I've not spent time at the elementary schools, and I look forward to doing so, but I've spent time with the faculty at the secondary schools. I'm very impressed, and I believe that this organization has the potential to transform initially North Carolina and then perhaps the entire country for the better. So I love the fact that you're providing very high quality, low cost private education. I think this is a model that needs to spread everywhere. I want to talk about a couple of things. First, I want to sort of position the role of Socratic education as I see it potentially at Luddy schools. Then I'll talk more about why I believe that Socratic education is an important element of secondary education. And then finally, I'll talk about the ethical dimension of this kind of education, both here and beyond here, because I think that's part of why I see this as so extremely important to the health and well-being of our children and our nation. Just to start with, I want to acknowledge that direct instruction and Socratic education are different modalities. I think that it's important to understand that they're also a developmental continuum. And although there are lots of psychological theories of developmental continuums, for me, I always like to look to traditional cultures. And in all traditional cultures, at the age of 13, young people were regarded as adults. And so, you know, the young man would be expected to go out and hunt his first deer, that sort of thing. And I think it's appropriate at the secondary level for young people to begin to accept greater responsibility. In our society, at this point, we don't really allow young people to accept responsibility. In many ways, I see many young people in their teens and even into their 20s not really becoming full responsible adults. So in the context of pedagogy, what that means is while direct instruction provides a profound foundation in terms of training students to focus, be respectful, pay attention, and to learn knowledge, as they become older, we want them to also become articulate defenders of developing their own ideas and then defending their own ideas. And so that's kind of the Socratic transition in the high school, is to go from a child who needs to learn to a young adult who needs to still learn, but also learn how to have their own ideas and to defend them. Just as in traditional cultures you need to hunt your own deer, I see this as you need to be a mature person who has and is responsible for your own ideas intellectually, morally, socially, in every dimension, and to defend them. And I think a lot of people don't realize that's part of being an adult in our society, is standing for something and being able to say why you stand for something, and to really be able to defend what you stand for in lots of different ways. So with that frame in mind, I want to kind of go back to how I got to this point. I attended a college, St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's a great books college. There's another one in Annapolis, Maryland. There are other great books programs across the US. typically at small liberal arts colleges. Occasionally a larger university will have St. John Great Books program within it. Although it's known as the Great Books, where we study the classics of Western civilization, starting with Homer and Plato, Sophocles, Aeschylus, we eventually get to the 20th century, and we also read James Joyce. We study the history of music from Gregorian chant all the way to jazz and ragtime in the 1920s. We also do the history of mathematics and science, starting with Euclid and Archimedes, and ultimately reading Einstein and Schrödinger in the 20th century. As a consequence, we're exposed to the development of Western civilization, and sadly, many universities are diminishing the role of the study of Western civilization. And yet, Western civilization, whatever its faults, has given us the extraordinary wealth that we have, the extraordinary standard of living, which is being copied around the world, the extraordinary commitment to human rights, which, as we see with ISIS in Iraq, is not necessarily a standard around the world. There are many ways in which this is an incredible and amazing tradition that has very specific intellectual roots, and it's worth training our students as much as possible in the foundations of this cultural meme. So at St. John's, the basic format was we would read a text before class, and then we would come to class in typically small groups, sometimes 10 to 15. Seminars in the evenings were 20 to 22 or 25 occasionally, so sometimes larger classes. And then the leader, the adult, the tutor, would ask a question, and then the students would discuss the question. Critically, the leader did not have the answer in mind of the question. The leader would ask a sincerely open-ended question. What is truth? What is justice? What is piety? You know, these are all Socratic questions. When Plato wrote his dialogues in which Socrates was the main character, Socrates is asking the wise men of Athens, what is truth? What is piety? What is justice? And so forth, with the notion that these are important and difficult questions that we need to come to our own understanding of. Some people think of Socratic questioning as manipulative. I do not. I don't think the original Socrates was manipulative. I believe that it's actually hard to come up with a really definitive, coherent, consistent understanding of the truth. And that the Socratic questioning, the Socratic meme, is driving us all to become ever clearer and sharper about what we mean when we think about big, important questions in life. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead once said that all of Western civilization may be seen as a series of footnotes to Plato. I think he's really thinking of Socrates. And in a certain sense, this constant asking, how do we know what we know? How do we know it is good? How do we know it is noble? This sort of driving quest to refine of what we mean by these things is the underlying engine of Western civilization. So that was at the St. John's college level. How on earth do we do this with younger students? Because in many ways, younger students are different. So when I first began, after graduating from St. John's, I started leading Socratic seminars in Chicago public schools. And I would go into often inner city classrooms and find a very different environment. And sometimes the discussions would go well, sometimes they went poorly. Then I moved to Alaska, where I worked with the Alaska Paideia Project to train teachers. And my colleagues in Alaska had, I would say, developed new and improved techniques for more consistent Socratic seminars. One of the things they did was they focused a lot more on close textual analysis. Often, if you take a junior Great Books training, and junior Great Books is a cousin to the Socratic practice I engage in, or Touchstones is another one. I respect both junior Great Books and Touchstones. But they typically have students read stories outside of class, and you come and discuss it inside of class. We found that very often students today don't read outside of class, and even if they read, sometimes they pass their eyes over the page without really thinking. If you look at Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book, a classic from the 1940s, and again, Mortimer Adler is part of the tradition from whence I come. Mortimer Adler is encouraging you to basically argue and fight with the author all the way through. You'll see annotations where when Mortimer Adler is reading a book, he's a very combative sort of guy. So you almost picture Mortimer Adler, rah, 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 all the way through a book. But we want that kind of engagement with the book. We want you and your students and everybody who reads to be constantly thinking and arguing with the author. So one of the techniques we learned in Alaska was to read very conceptually dense, difficult material, but to read it slowly together and then to decipher it almost like a puzzle. So even in, say, inner city schools, we would read paragraphs from Kant and Plato and Aristotle, where initially the student's first response was, after reading it, was, shoo, they can't understand anything at all. But then by means of working together to analyze words, clauses, paragraphs, sentences, paragraphs, we would develop an understanding, and they learned how to decipher complex texts. If you look, to jump ahead, at the SAT critical reading section, that largely consists of very conceptually difficult passages followed by nuanced questions about the meaning of those passages. Many people think SAT verbal is primarily vocabulary, and while it is vocabulary dense, it's not just vocabulary. You really need to analyze sentences and to discern the meaning, nuanced distinctions of meaning that depend not just on the terms, but also the context and the sentence structure and the overall tone of the passage. So this sort of reading of dense conceptual texts is critical to doing well on the SAT, and in some of my schools I've had extraordinary SAT verbal gains because basically every day we're reading and discussing complex texts. In addition to learning how to decipher text, we spend a lot more time working on the group dynamic. Sometimes Socratic seminars were really enjoyable for everyone, sometimes they were boring and horrible. Why were they boring and horrible? Usually it's because there's an unbalanced dynamic in the group. If a few kids are dominating and the rest are shut up, and if some kids are intimidating others, it soon becomes very boring. If there's one know-it-all who's basically shutting everybody else down, the process is not fun. So we spent a lot of time coaching interpersonal dynamics so students could be mutually respectful. Sometimes I would joke that a lot of what I do as a Socratic seminar educator is train students so that person A speaks, person B listens and thinks and responds. And it sounds really simple, but if you deal with middle schoolers, it can take a long time to get person A speaks, person B listens and thinks and responds. But bit by bit, they can learn how to become respectful conversationalists. And when they do, they can become incredibly powerful as a group, where they can move through very difficult texts in a respectful way and learn, and also think divergently and enjoy the conversation. But then the third element that we added as an explicit way to train students Socratically in our Alaskan programs was learning to take ideas seriously. And I think for a lot of educated adults that sounds strange, because typically if you go to a college, especially if you go to a liberal arts college, and if you read books because you love reading books, you already take ideas seriously. You don't imagine that we might need to train people to take ideas seriously. And yet for some students, school is a ritual where one does what you are asked to do, but the notion that the ideas themselves are important, meaningful parts of your life is somewhat alien. And so sometimes I'd even be in a wealthy suburban district at a public school where the students were all off to competitive colleges, but we would have a discussion about ideas, and the students would simply want to know what the right answer is, with no notion that what is just or what is true are things that they need to think and internalize in their own way. So we would spend a lot more time putting students on the spot. How do you know what is true? What do you do if something is false? How do you discern? Does it matter to you if something is true? And really making them stand up for their own ideas. Bit by bit, we would transition school cultures from ones where students didn't care about ideas to schools where they did care about ideas and they held each other accountable for their ideas. If somebody says something that is morally offensive, other students take them seriously, and that's a problem. So we want to create cultures in which students do understand that ideas have power and that they're responsible for the ideas they develop and articulate and stand for in public. That also makes the conversation much richer, because it's no longer the teacher wants me to talk about symbolism. It's I am a mature, responsible human being in this community, and what I say matters. It matters to the teachers, it matters to my parents, it matters to society, it matters to my peers. I am a moral agent with autonomy and authority. And if I don't act, if my beliefs are not in alignment with my actions, people will hold me accountable. So sometimes people talk about character education. Aristotle talked about virtues, And one of the Aristotle's saying, and very Aristotelian on this, is virtue is a habit, not an act. So virtue is not just how you act once or twice, it's how you act day in, day out. It's what are your emotional habits, what are your intellectual habits, how do you approach life day by day, moment by moment. So I see the process of Socratic practice as not just an event, a Socratic seminar that takes place, not a pedagogical tool that one might use from time to time in order to diversify classroom teaching. For me, this really is a matter of creating virtue cultures where we take ideas seriously, hold each other accountable, and take on the responsibility of being responsible adults in our communities and our countries. So that's kind of the 10,000-foot level. I'm going to talk more practically. If those who have not taught advanced placement courses want to see the concrete applicability in college admissions, advanced placement tests in history, in literature, and even in biology require analytical essays. And you might ask, what's the relationship between Socratic practice and analytical essay writing? I would say, first of all, analytical essay writing is one of the most difficult things to teach. People often know math and physics are hard. It's a lot of work to learn how to do well on math and physics tests, and I love math and physics. They're important. What people don't often realize is that learning to write rigorous analytical essays is a very sophisticated skill. You have to develop the ability to articulate a thesis and defend a thesis. Just to go back to the old 5-paragraph essay structure, thesis, supporting paragraph, supporting paragraph, supporting paragraph, conclusion. The supporting matters. That is, in order to write a good essay, you can't just have a thesis and put junk in between. You have to have a rigorous case where the evidence used in your supporting paragraphs in fact does support your thesis. So how do you help students develop the ability to do this? Well, one of the things that happens in a Socratic discussion is person A says something, person B says something with which person A disagrees, and then person A has to defend his or her opinion, typically based on evidence from the text. So then person B responds with other evidence from the text, person A responds with other evidence from the text, and in essence, they are outlining an essay. They have just had a thesis. I believe Tom Sawyer is about X, and somebody else argues something else, and then they have to find textual evidence to support it. So one of the things we do in the dialogue is help them see that their arguments, which initially they just feel like they're talking, are actually the foundations for potentially rigorous arguments. And our job as educators is to help them see that they are sketching essays, and that this is a thesis statement, this is the way in which this either supports or does not support the thesis. And we can develop rigorous essay writing skills by means of connecting the dialogue to analytical essay writing. That is one of the most powerful ways to develop performance, a high-level performance on AP exams down the road. So we often encourage educators in middle and high school to use Socratic as a means to teach high-level reading and high-level writing as a path to better AP performance. AP requires a lot of content teaching. There's still a lot of content to be developed, but they also need the ability to argue for ideas themselves. I also want to do a bit on the real world. I would say one of the most powerful skills in life is to be articulate, to be able to speak, to be able to read and write. Several decades ago, I actually saw an article, this is in the 1980s, about people who made more than $100,000 a year, and that today is probably $150,000, $180,000 a year. And it said one thing they had in common was they had great verbal skills. They were great at presenting, they were great at negotiating, they were great at talking. And it sounds strange, we all talk. You go to the lunchroom, your kids are talking, everybody talks. But if one has well-developed verbal skills, then one can explain one's ideas to diverse audiences. And whether one is an engineer or a doctor or even an auto mechanic, the more you can communicate verbally, the more you can explain projects, ideas, points of view, the better you are in terms of communicating with diverse audiences, and any organization is going to find valuable somebody who can talk to diverse audiences. So quite aside from AP and college admissions and that sort of preparatory pathway, I see this as a very powerful tool for developing young people who can talk in the world in such a way that they have a much wider range of career options. I'll give you one other example. I had at one point a couple of students who were seniors at Stanford who had gone to a school that I'd previously taught at. And we asked them what advantage did they have going to this small private school as opposed to their peers at Stanford. And they said with respect to knowledge, their peers at Stanford from public schools were just as capable as they were. They said the biggest advantage they had over their public school peers was in the realm of talking to people. They were so comfortable talking to adults, talking to professors, engaging as a mature person with diverse people, that many of their public school peers may have gotten good scores on tests, but did not have the maturity and confidence to engage diverse adults in real conversations. And as a consequence, as seniors at Stanford, they had built more substantial networks and had, I would say, some relationship capital that some of their public school peers had not had. And I think that's sort of an interesting additional way in which to see we're building capacity in these young people. So we build capacity in them to do better in the college admissions game. We build capacity for them to do better during college by means of developing this relationship capital. And we are building capacity in our young people to succeed in the professional world. And then finally, we're building capacity in our young people to be, again, leaders in our communities. I want to go back to something that's especially important to me in terms of leadership in the community, which is independent thought. Earlier, we were talking about the advanced placement test a little bit, the American History Advanced Placement Test. One of the things that Amity Schlaes and I agree upon is that with respect to the Great Depression, it's egregiously inaccurate. I studied with Gary Becker, Nobel laureate economist, and I know economics fairly well. There are no legitimate economists today who believe that inequality of wealth caused the Great Depression. And yet, many times, American history AP still talks as if inequality of wealth caused the Great Depression. It's a case where the historians are not in alignment with the economists, and I would say the economists know more about this than the historians do. But if the students taking AP American history regard it as the only truth, if they always regard external authorities as the only legitimate authorities, then they're not going to have the capacity to have distinctive positions and stand up for them. One thing about the Socratic dialogues is you're always going to have to figure out where the best evidence lies, because somebody is always disagreeing with you. You always have to figure out, based on the text, what it really means. I, as leader, don't give them hints as to what the text is going to mean. I want them to find textual evidence and defend their interpretation based on that textual evidence. And doing that over and over and over again, they need to develop an internal compass about when an argument is rigorous and when an argument is not rigorous. And they also need to have the courage, and it is a matter of courage, not to cave in to popular pressure. So if they believe that they have evidence that something is true and the rest of the group is going in a different direction, I want them to stand up to their beliefs and develop the ability to argue their beliefs vis-a-vis the rest of the class. And sometimes I've had kids who are intellectually less than confident against socially and intellectually confident students, and I've seen these students fight, as it were, argue against the rest of the class and overcome them based on evidence. And that's an extremely powerful experience for a young person to have had. So my ideal goal is to develop cultures wherever I go with schools, where the students have these extraordinary abilities for college admissions, these extraordinary abilities for success in college, these extraordinary abilities for success in the workplace, and ultimately these extraordinary abilities to be human beings with deep integrity and a commitment to the true, the good, and the beautiful. Because I think that many of the best features of Western civilization are no longer being cultivated in many conventional public schools nor in many mainstream universities. I see pockets such as the Luddy Schools where these characteristics are being taken seriously and developed as critical to the well-being of our children in our world. And so if there's anything I can do to help support the culture of Socratic inquiry at the Luddy Schools and the expansion of Luddy Schools as far and as wide as it can, I absolutely want to do so, and I want to cheer you on and compliment you for all of the hard work you're doing. So many, many thanks to you for everything you're doing. Thank you.
Sure, sure.
We'll take a few quick questions if anybody has any. Very good. If you give your name and the school.
My name is Chris Vickery. I'm a digital media teacher here at Franklin Academy High School. What I'm curious about is when you're doing the debates, do you find that implementing a forced period of listening and thinking, because a lot of times the students will form the response in their heads and it causes them to fail in the critical listening aspect, do you implement a forced waiting period, and does that help them in the listening process?
No, that's a great question. I would say yes, certainly want that phenomenon, but two ways in which I approach that is, one, I like to use texts that are so difficult that nobody can just think off their cuff. They have to slow down and think. The other is I often avoid politically controversial pieces, because I find if something has been in the news, then the students will just impulsively say whatever they've heard on whatever news they listen to. And so I want also to present them with fresh topics where they've never thought about this at all, and they have to think about it for the first time. But yeah, we absolutely want the habit of thought.
Good morning, or afternoon, I guess now. I'm Dan Kelly over at Franklin Academy Middle School, and I guess my question was, you brought up morality. How do you then, if the definitions of truth, value, justice, those type of things kind of follow a social zeitgeist, how do you then define morality, immorality, amorality when you're facilitating these?
That's a really good question. I would say one way in which we anchor things is our conversations are focused on interpreting a text, and so by means of interpreting a text, our job is to understand, what did Aristotle say, what did Plato say, and of course the texts you choose, I think the school as a whole wants to select texts that are in alignment with the overall core beliefs of the school. And that's really up to the faculty administration and leadership of the school. But I would say the other thing about focusing on texts is our society is so radically relativist, where people don't believe anything is true. Even at the level of textual interpretation, I'll have students say, oh, it means whatever you want it to mean. And so in order to get them to realize that's ridiculous, I'll say, if we're studying Aristotle, so is this a chicken soup recipe? Well, no, it's not a chicken soup recipe. Okay, then what does the word truth mean? What does virtue mean? What does each word mean? And get them to realize that, in fact, if we want to communicate, words have meaning. So I would say, before going off into extremely controversial questions, I want to create a consensus around words have meaning, and we can communicate meaning vis-a-vis words, and that we have an obligation to the text and to each other to have an accurate understanding of the text. And so at a very foundational level, you choose texts that represent, I would say, valid, important moral perspectives. They can disagree somewhat, but still, if you're reading classic texts, that's not too much of an issue. And then, more than anything, let's agree that words have meaning and we're responsible for accurate understandings of the text.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.